Okay, so if you can drink a glass of milk right now without your stomach hating you for it, congratulations. You're carrying a genetic mutation that's only about 6,000 years old. And for thousands of years before that mutation even existed, humans were drinking milk anyway. 9,000 years ago, someone milked an animal for the first time, drank it, and, based on what we now know about human biology at the time, almost certainly regretted it. So why'd they do it again? And why are you doing it again this morning? Probably without thinking twice. Today, we're going all the way back to figure out exactly when, where, and why humans started drinking milk. And honestly, the real answer is way weirder than you'd expect, because it turns out we were drinking milk long before our bodies could actually handle it. Let's get into it. First, let's set the scene. For the vast, vast majority of human existence, nobody was drinking milk from other animals. Why would they? Humans were hunter-gatherers. You ate what you could catch, kill, or dig up. Animals weren't your roommates. They were dinner, and dinner doesn't usually let you milk it first. And biologically, this makes total sense too. Like literally every other mammal on Earth, humans are built to drink milk exactly once in their lives, as babies. Your body produces an enzyme called lactase, which breaks down lactose, the natural sugar found in milk. But that enzyme is only supposed to stick around while you're nursing. Once you're weaned off breast milk, your body basically shuts the factory down. It assumes, correctly, for most of history, that you're never going to need to digest milk again. Why waste energy producing an enzyme you'll never use? So somewhere around 10 or 12,000 years ago, everyone on the planet, every single human being, everywhere, no exceptions, was lactose intolerant as an adult. That wasn't a diet trend or a personal choice. That was just the default setting for our entire species. Nobody was out here sipping milk casually. It simply wasn't a thing yet. So how do we go from that to a modern human casually pouring a glass of milk with zero consequences? The story starts with agriculture. And honestly, it starts with one of the biggest lifestyle shifts our species has ever gone through. Around 10,000 BC, in the hilly regions near modern-day Turkey, something huge was happening. Groups of humans were slowly transitioning away from hunting and gathering and towards something new: farming, permanent settlements, and crucially, the domestication of animals. First, it was sheep and goats. Then, a bit later, somewhere between 8,000 and 7,500 BC, cattle joined the club, likely domesticated from a wild ancestor species called the aurochs, a massive, powerful wild ox that honestly looked nothing like the cows we know today. And once you've got animals that stick around, that don't run away, that you're actively feeding and protecting, you start asking a very practical question. What else can I get from this thing besides meat? You've already put in the work keeping it alive. Why not see what else it's got to offer? And the answer, staring these early farmers right in the face every single day, was milk. Now, quick side note here, because this is one of those questions that sounds silly until you actually think about it. Why cows, goats, and sheep specifically? Humans have domesticated all kinds of animals over the centuries. Pigs, for example, have been kept by humans for around 9,000 years, just as long as cattle. So why is there no pig milk carton sitting next to the hole and skim in your grocery store? Turns out, it's not about taste, and it's definitely not because pig milk is dangerous. In fact, people who've actually tried it describe it as rich and creamy, with a fat content of around 8.5%, more than double that of cow's milk. The real problem is entirely practical, and honestly, it comes down to how these animals are built and how they behave. A cow has 4 teats, positioned conveniently, and will happily let milk flow for several minutes at a time once she's used to being milked. A pig, on the other hand, can have up to 14 teats, small and awkwardly placed along her belly, and each one only releases milk in quick bursts lasting about 15 seconds before shutting off again. Multiply that by 14 tiny, uncooperative taps, and you start to see the problem. Then there's temperament. Cows, after thousands of years of selective breeding, are famously docile. You can walk right up to one. A nursing sow is a completely different story. Protective, defensive, and genuinely dangerous if she feels threatened. Farmers who've actually attempted pig milking describe getting charged, and unlike getting kicked by a stubborn goat, getting hit by a 250-pound sow can be lethal. So early humans, without any of this being written down anywhere, essentially ran a cost-benefit calculation through trial and error. Which animals give a decent volume of milk, cooperate enough to actually be milked safely, and are worth the daily effort? Cows, goats, sheep, and later, in other parts of the world, horses, camels, and yaks all cleared that bar. Pigs, despite being domesticated just as early, simply never did. It's a small detail, but it's a great example of how a lot of why do we do this and not that questions in history come down to pure practicality, not preference. Okay, back to the main story. The earliest hard evidence we have of humans actually collecting animal milk comes from pottery, not from bones or teeth. Archaeologists found ancient shards near the Sea of Marmara, in that same Turkey region, with milk fat residue baked right into the clay itself, preserved for thousands of years. That pottery dates back almost 9,000 years. So somebody, nearly 9 millennia ago, was milking an animal and storing that milk in a container they'd made with their own hands. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. Storing milk in a pot doesn't mean you're drinking it straight, and it definitely doesn't mean your body was thrilled about it. Remember, at this point in history, humans were still 100% lactose intolerant as adults. Drinking a big glass of raw milk would have meant bloating, cramping, and let's just say, some very urgent trips away from the campfire. Not exactly a great advertisement for your brand new domesticated cow. So what did early farmers do instead? They got clever. Really clever, actually. Instead of drinking milk fresh, they figured out that if you let milk ferment, or curdle, or age, you get something completely different. Cheese. Yogurt. And here's the key part that makes this whole story work. The fermentation process, powered by naturally occurring bacteria, breaks down a huge portion of the lactose before it ever reaches your stomach. Those bacteria are essentially pre-digesting the sugar for you, doing the hard work your own body couldn't do yet. So cheese making shows up clearly in the archaeological record around 5,500 BC. That actually predates butter by a couple thousand years. Butter doesn't show up until around 2,500 BC, first appearing in the historical record on an ancient Sumerian tablet depicting early dairy production. In fact, the word butter might even come from an old Greek term that literally translates to cow cheese. Dairy, it turns out, started less as a delicious treat and more as a clever workaround for a body that technically couldn't handle dairy at all. Okay, but drinking straight milk, not cheese, not yogurt, just plain milk, when did that actually become a normal, safe, everyday thing to do? This is where the story gets really cool, because in 2019, researchers at the University of York did something pretty clever. Instead of looking at pottery, they looked at teeth. Specifically, the hardened dental plaque of Neolithic humans buried in Britain at archaeological sites like Hambledon Hill, Hazelton North, and Banbury Lane. Trapped inside that ancient, mineralized plaque, they found traces of a protein called beta-lactoglobulin. This protein naturally shows up in cow, sheep, and goat milk, but it does not occur in human breast milk at all. Which means, if you find it stuck in someone's teeth thousands of years later, that person was, without a doubt, consuming animal dairy while they were alive. And the age of these particular remains? About 6,000 years old. This became the earliest direct physical evidence, not indirect, not inferred just from pottery residue, but direct evidence, preserved straight from someone's actual mouth, that humans were consuming milk products regularly enough to leave a lasting trace. And here's a detail that makes this even more fascinating. Similar research done on ancient skeletons in Kenya and Sudan found dairy consumption going back just as far, maybe even further, which is a genuinely big deal because it means dairy drinking wasn't some uniquely European innovation that slowly spread outward to the rest of the world. It developed independently, around a similar time frame, in completely different regions with completely different populations. Africa and Europe were essentially arriving at the same wild idea. Hey, this milk thing might actually be worth pursuing, completely separately from one another. Now, here's the part of this story that genuinely messes with your head a little if you sit with it. Remember how we said humans, biologically, were still lactose intolerant as adults at this point? Well, that 6,000-year-old evidence of milk drinking actually predates the genetic mutation that lets adult humans properly digest lactose in the first place. Let that sink in for a second. People were drinking milk before their bodies had evolved the actual ability to digest it comfortably. This creates this bizarre chicken and egg problem that scientists have gone back and forth on for years. Did humans start drinking milk because they'd already evolved the ability to digest it easily? Or did they push themselves to drink milk anyway, mostly fermented, to cut down on the lactose content? Sometimes just pushing through genuine discomfort because the calories were simply too valuable to pass up, especially during food shortages, famine, or harsh winters? Most researchers today lean toward that second explanation. Early humans were likely already consuming some dairy regularly, mostly in fermented forms with much lower lactose content, occasionally dealing with unpleasant symptoms anyway because the nutritional payoff, protein, fat, calories, calcium, was worth the trade-off. And here's where evolution steps in. Any individual who happened to carry a random genetic mutation that let them digest lactose smoothly as an adult, without any of those uncomfortable side effects, suddenly had a real, measurable survival advantage. More reliable nutrition, better odds of surviving a bad harvest year, healthier, better-fed children who were more likely to survive to adulthood themselves. So that mutation, often called lactase persistence, started spreading. And by evolutionary standards, it spread remarkably fast. Researchers estimate the trait began appearing and getting passed down starting around 6,000 years ago, eventually becoming common across large parts of Europe, certain regions of Africa, and parts of the Middle East, wherever dairy farming became central to daily survival. And this actually leads us to clear up a myth that's still floating around today, because it's a persistent one and honestly kind of an unfortunate one. There's this idea that the ability to digest milk as an adult is somehow a uniquely European trait, like it's biologically tied to one specific group of people. That's simply not accurate. The archaeological and genetic evidence clearly shows that lactase persistence evolved independently in multiple, genetically unrelated populations across the world, including several groups in Africa around remarkably similar timeframes. This wasn't one single origin point radiating outward across the globe. It was convergent evolution, the same useful trait popping up again and again in different places, wherever dairy farming became a serious, central part of daily life and survival. Once this genetic trait started spreading, dairy didn't just become a nice-to-have side food. In some cultures, it became the literal backbone of entire civilizations. Out on the vast Eurasian steppe, that enormous, sweeping stretch of grassland connecting Europe all the way to East Asia, nomadic groups built their entire way of life around herding animals. Sheep, goats, horses, camels, yaks, even reindeer in the colder northern regions. Dairy wasn't a side dish out there. It was fuel, plain and simple. It's part of what powered a long, sprawling succession of steppe empires, from early groups like the Xiongnu all the way through to the Mongol Empire centuries later. Entire military campaigns, entire migrations across thousands of miles were sustained in part by portable, preserved dairy products that didn't spoil easily on long journeys. And it wasn't purely practical either. It clearly meant something emotionally and culturally too. Archaeologists studying children's graves in what's now Germany found small, playful, animal-shaped clay pots, complete with tiny spouts, specifically designed for feeding infants. And when researchers tested the residue left inside, they found traces of cow's milk. These weren't just cold, functional feeding tools. They were deliberately shaped like little animals, almost certainly to make feeding time a bit more fun, a bit more comforting for a baby. Which is honestly a surprisingly sweet, human detail buried inside all this ancient chemistry and archaeology. So where does all of this leave us today, thousands of years later? Even with all that time for the lactase persistence mutation to spread around the globe, it never actually became universal. Right now, researchers estimate that around 68% of the entire global population is still lactose intolerant as adults. That number is worth sitting with for a second because it's actually the historical default for our species. The people who can casually drink a full glass of milk without any digestive issues at all? In the grand scope of human history and human genetics, they're technically the outliers, not the norm. That's part of why dairy consumption still looks so different depending on where you are in the world. In large parts of East Asia, for instance, traditional diets historically leaned much less on drinking milk directly, and lactose intolerance rates there remain among the highest anywhere on the planet. Meanwhile, in places like Northern Europe or parts of East Africa among cattle herding communities like the Maasai, lactase persistence rates are dramatically higher, sometimes affecting the vast majority of the adult population. Same species, same starting point 12,000 years ago, wildly different genetic outcomes today, all traceable back to which populations leaned hardest into dairy farming. So next time you pour milk into your coffee or make yourself a bowl of cereal without a second thought, just remember that simple, everyday habit is the end result of roughly 10,000 years of trial and error. Animal domestication that started almost by accident. A surprisingly practical filtering process that decided which animals were even worth milking in the first place. Fermentation experiments to dodge a stubborn digestive problem nobody fully understood yet. A random genetic mutation that just happened to show up at the right time and catch on, and a whole lot of ancient humans who were, frankly, a little too committed to a food source that, biologically speaking, kept trying to make them sick. We didn't evolve to drink milk and then start doing it. We started doing it first, dealt with the uncomfortable consequences for thousands of years, and evolution eventually, slowly, caught up to our stubbornness. Kind of makes that morning glass of milk hit a little different, huh?